Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gustina. Joining us this week for the first time is a man named Avery Stempel. He is the co-president of New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives, NYMHA, a nonprofit that's looking to legalize the medicinal use of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives argues that New Yorkers are experiencing a critical mental health and wellness crisis. The present approaches to treatment, they say, are insufficient, and New Yorkers need alternatives. Avery Stempel is also the owner and operator of Collar City Mushrooms, an indoor urban vertical mushroom farm, mycological education center, and community gathering space. It's now located at Indian Ladder Farms in Altamont. We'll talk with Avery Stempel about all of this and so much more. But first, welcome to the Capital Connection, Avery Stempel.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for having me.
It's so great to have you here, Avery, and I'll give the listeners a little insight. You run Collar City Mushrooms, and my wife and I had the opportunity to attend a dinner there, which was made entirely of mushrooms. And since then, I've been to a dinner where you paired it over at Indian Ladder Farms with both different kinds of beer and cider, and it was a really wonderful experience. Now, these are not psilocybin mushrooms. This is just a mushroom dinner, and then I became aware of what you were doing. And so why don't we start with you telling our listeners about yourself, your story, and how you came to this point.
Sure, David. We opened a culinary and legally medicinal mushroom farm in Troy, New York. Our first home was in Lansingburg, and we were a product of the pandemic. So I was managing the Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute campus. And when gathering was prohibited, I was furloughed. And so I took the opportunity to pivot into what had been a hobby and a love of all things fungi and open a culinary mushroom farm. And with my background in education and arts, we decided to create a space where people could gather and learn and enjoy all of the things that mushrooms can provide. Out of that front of house facing space, people coming in shopping assumed that we were offering alternative mushrooms. So opening that storefront and having people come in, a lot of our guests assumed that what we were selling were mind-altering mushrooms. And, we often would have to redirect them to the fact that these are federally controlled substances, in fact, illegal. But it was happening with quite often frequency. And my friend Corinne, she decided that we needed to do something about it. And Corinne was at that time a radio producer for the Sanctuary for Independent Media. And so we did a couple interviews on the Hudson Mohawk radio program. And then we put together a 2-hour symposium. And we invited lawmakers and therapists and lawyers and had a discussion about the current condition and status of psilocybin-containing mushrooms and what needed to happen in order to create some type of legal access. So out of that, we started the New York Psilocybin Action Committee, NYPAC, and started hosting meetings right there at our culinary mushroom farm and gained momentum. We've had 2 lobby days at the Capitol so far. One was an entire week where we met with dozens and dozens of lawmakers, and we really have not seen any pushback on the reason for creating legal access. Most people just want to ensure that it's safe and has the proper guardrails so that the potential collapse of society doesn't happen from some of these things changing.
So when does New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives arrive? Now that you've got this action committee, I assume that's the next thing that comes, right? Form a nonprofit.
That's correct. So while we were operating the New York Psilocybin Action Committee, there was a parallel organization called New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives that was started by a lawyer in New York City. And he was no longer able to run that organization or do with it what he had hoped. And so he passed it on to us.
How do you get that connection?
Yeah, well, he was one of the lawyers on the symposium.
Okay, so he had knowledge of this already and said, here, I've got a name for you.
That's correct. And we love the name, we love the logo, and we decided to adopt that. We formed our board and passed a resolution and voted to adopt this. We started to get political right there. So we started operating under the banner of this 501c4, increasing the frequency of our conversations with lawmakers. And we had advocates from Dickinson Avella join us and help us make connections to different lawmakers.
For our listeners, what's Dickinson Avella?
Dickinson Avella is an advocacy group that hire out their services to nonprofits in order to help get legislation passed. So we continued our conversations with lawmakers. We've met with all of the legislators who have drafted the bills so far. And we had a symposium for lawmakers at the Capitol, including Reconsider, which is a group that were the executive producers for Fantastic Fungi, which was a movie that was on Netflix.
Saw it.
And they have done dozens of short documentary films where they interview people who have benefited from plant-based medicines, from peyote to ayahuasca to psilocybin-containing mushrooms. And they are using these videos to help educate people. And we now are bringing it to lawmakers. Not that lawmakers aren't people, but
some might think so, but they are people.
But we are showing these videos to show these substances do have some therapeutic value to them. I hesitate in calling them medicine. I really need to retrain my language on that, because one of the challenges that people are encountering across the country is passing bills that focus solely on calling them medicinal. And cannabis was able to roll out on a medicinal level because of what's called the Cole Memo.
I was going to ask you about that. Talk about the Cole Memo.
The Cole Memo was drafted by a federal lawyer that said, hey, let's not go after people in the states that pass legal cannabis laws.
The federal government.
The federal
won't go
government.
after.
Correct. So while cannabis is still a Schedule I substance, meaning that it has no accepted medicinal value, there are states, many of the states, I think more states than not, that have passed some bill allowing legal access, whether it's medicinal or adult recreational use. And because of this Cole Memo, the DEA and other federal policing agencies hold off on any prosecution of people using, selling, or administering cannabis in the states where they have passed that. Psilocybin-containing mushrooms do not have a similar memo. And so Utah passed a medicinal bill, and this bill allows for hospitals to store and administer and oversee people having psilocybin experiences. And 0 hospitals signed up to actually carry out this bill.
Why would they want to be subject to a raid by the federal government?
That's correct. And not only a raid, but a withdrawal of funds. Because
that's where they get their funding.
That's where they get their funding. And so if you are operating against the law on a federal level, then you are at risk of having your funding pulled. And one of our guest speakers for a New Yorker for Mental Health Alternatives meeting was the former and now acting police chief, Brendan Cox. And one of the things that he has been advocating for is access to these substances so that police and firefighters and veterans can benefit from taking these substances in a therapeutic way.
So now we're really getting into the why. Why do we want to get this legalized? You already mentioned your why for getting into this, which is that so many people who came into Collar City Mushrooms were expecting psilocybin, and you realize there's this need or this call for it. And now you see it is those emergency workers, soldiers, those people with PTSD, those who are suffering mentally, who have found relief from it.
That's correct, David. And ultimately, our heroes should not be criminalized for their attempts to heal. No one should be criminalized for their attempts to heal. But because it is a federal controlled substance, if they choose to try one of these alternatives, they can be persecuted. So right now, people are going out of the country to countries where it is legal in order to have these ceremonies, or they are going underground. And there is a robust underground network of therapists that are helping people regain their lives. Well, let me back up and just point out that the people coming into the farm asking for psilocybin-containing mushrooms weren't just like, oh, I want to go to a concert and have a good time. They were, my father is in hospice and struggling with end of life, and I don't know what to do. Or my daughter is in her 40s and has been on SSRIs for decades, and they are not working, and she is suffering from suicidality, and I don't want her to go. And I mean, I am not a therapist. I am not a counselor. I am not a physician. But many people have revealed very intimate details of their emotional, psychological, and physical well-being in order to try to convince me to help them. And unfortunately, I do not want to risk my business or livelihood for anyone at this point, which is why it was so important to be like, well, we need to create change. And we need to allow these people to have access that want to choose one of these alternatives. You asked specifically about veterans and first responders. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Texas Representative Dan Crenshaw actually got passed in the National Defense Authorization Act psilocybin or psychedelic therapy for active duty members, because we are acknowledging that these substances make an immense impact on people's ability to recover from trauma. What they do is they encourage neural plasticity and allow the brain to kind of rewrite some of the trauma and access ways of healing that the medicines that we've tried so far haven't been able to unlock. I like to describe it as like a record, when we used to put vinyl on a table and have a needle going around. Some people get lost in a rumination cycle where the needle is just following that same track over and over again and reliving pains and suffering. What taking one of these substances that promotes neuroplasticity does is kind of pours fresh wax onto the record and allows that needle to progress so we can get out of that trauma. One of my closest friends and advocates, Joe McKay, is a former New York firefighter. He, on September 11th, 2001, had the day off, and he was working a fundraiser at a golf course. And one of his closest friends in the department was taking his shift. And when the first plane hit one of the Trade Center towers, they thought that it was an accident. The second plane hit the second tower, and they knew something was going on. So all extraneous activities were canceled, everything focused on responding to this incident. Joe lost 26 people that he was on a first name basis with, as well as, hundreds of other people that he worked with, and worked for months on the pile trying to recover anything that they could for reconciliation with survivors. After 2 months of basically nonstop work, he started being impacted by cluster headaches. And cluster headaches are a type of headache that is repeating, and research hasn't quite determined what specifically causes it, but exposure to smoke and chemicals and changes in schedule often trigger these attacks. Nothing that Joe tried helped these cluster headaches. So it was suggested by the firefighting medical team that he unfortunately resign from being a firefighter, which was his dream job. He loved it. He loved the camaraderie. He loved working in the city in that way. Once he was no longer a firefighter, he figured he had nothing left to lose. And so he sought access to psilocybin-containing mushrooms and had a small dose, and it actually stopped his headaches from happening. And then he was also on a variety of other medicines. He was on oxycodone and tramadol for pain, and he was on some SSRIs for depression because he lost so much in that one day. The SSRIs, they upped the dosage for him, and the psilocybin stopped being effective against his headaches. And so he took a larger dose. And when he took that larger dose, he had a psychedelic experience that allowed him to see that he was also suffering from PTSD and he was holding so much back. And when Joe tells this story and, he describes exactly what he saw and his pain as a giant, like, black sphere hovering over him. Well, coming out of that experience, he realized he needed to seek therapeutic help and really was able to process through his trauma and work through his depression. And I mean, he is such a ball of light now and such an advocate for access to these substances. What that experience also showed him was that he was hooked on the opioids that were just numbing him and not actually helping him heal at all. And so for him, his experience with psilocybin-containing mushrooms was, he calls it a hat trick. It allowed him to process his trauma, it stops his cluster headaches, and it helped him kick his opioid habit that he was stuck on. So it's absolutely amazing for him to get this.
We are speaking with Avery Stempel, co-president of New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives, NYMHA, a nonprofit looking to legalize the use of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Well, several lawmakers in New York have been listening and have heard you, and there are now 4 bills that have been put together. Why don't you talk about the legislation itself in New York?
Sure, absolutely. So the bills that are in process right now, some of them predate our existence. So Linda Rosenthal, she has proposed a bill to decriminalize psilocybin-containing mushrooms, as well as a variety of other plant-based natural entheogens. And that decriminalizing would deprioritize police action. So it wouldn't make it legal. It would just make it so that police wouldn't necessarily enforce the laws that are on the books to prosecute people. Pat Burke and Assemblymember Pat Burke and Senator Natalia Fernandez have proposed bills that would create a medicinal program. So that would create therapeutic centers similar to what they've done in Colorado and Oregon. And they've also proposed a pilot bill that focuses on Western New Yorkers, specifically around the Buffalo area, who have a high rate of veterans and first responders and other heroes who unfortunately are taking their lives at a remarkable rate. And this bill would allow those folks to enroll in a program that directly gives them therapy and access to these substances in order to try to work through their traumas and the depression that they are experiencing. Assemblymember Amy Paulin has proposed a bill that creates a permit-style system so that people who are encountering a myriad of problems from depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety to inflammation and things, which psilocybin also treats, as well as irritable bowel syndrome and a variety of physical conditions. And a person would take a course and get educated on the side effects, the counterindicators, and what may happen during an experience, and then be able to get access through legal distributors that will be approved in the state.
It seems like we have a problem when something has been stereotyped with then moving forward and treating it as something legitimate. Now, obviously, we've been able to do that in some sense with cannabis. The idea of the stoner and not getting anything done and there's really no use for it. It's a party drug kind of thing. And the same, I think you could say with psychedelics. They're for people who like the Grateful Dead or, who are going to use them to trip and have a great time. And as you said, use it for recreational purposes and completely, seemingly not acknowledging the medicinal value. And this, again, seems to be happening at the federal level, whereas the states, for some reason, seem to be more willing to listen. Do you see that sort of thing happening? How do you look at that?
Yes. Our biggest lift is disentangling the misinformation that has spread from all of the work that has happened in the past to keep these substances out of the public's hands.
And quite frankly, it's not like it really is out of the public's
Absolutely
hands.
not.
The black market flourishes.
It really does, but the challenge with operating only in a black market is that not having regulation to ensure that what people are consuming is safe and actually what's on the label, there is no label, is what's critical. And that there are so many people who want to try one of these substances but do not have access to an underground market. People who are suffering from depression, people who are at end of life, they really aren't often the people who would risk going to jail in order to try something like this. My friend Corinne, she's also working with the Compassion in Choices. She's trying to pass the end-of-life bill in New York right now.
The 11th year they've been trying to do this.
The 11th year, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. This year, they are making movement that shows real promise. And psilocybin-containing mushrooms can help folks at end of life as well and get through the challenges of letting go and the ennui that people are often suffering with of the, why is this happening? What is anything worth? And really give meaning back to the last moments of their life.
And I assume with the therapy model, it's going to be guided. People would be worried, to be alone in a situation like that and maybe lose their capacity to get a grip on reality. But if you're in a guided situation, that's different, where you feel safe, you feel comfortable. I assume that's what New York is intending to do.
That's absolutely correct. And allowing the legal access to these substances would give therapists and counselors the ability to lead people through these experiences without the threat of losing their license. And that's really, another critical piece of this puzzle that needs to happen because people are already doing this. And there are people who are giving folks experiences, but there's no certification, there's no regulation for that either. And there are people that are not giving people the best experiences. And there's no repercussions right now for those folks, unfortunately.
We're speaking with Avery Stempel, co-president of New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives. How can people get in touch or find out more?
Sure. Yes. You can follow our Instagram at NYMHA_. We also have a Facebook, and our website, nymha.com, has a lot of ways that you can connect with us. And it also, one of the biggest components to helping spread this advocacy is just sharing your stories. And there is a page on our website that has some conversation starters for you to use to interact with your friends and family about why you think this is important and how you can, help bring this change about.
Yeah, and I know that because you're a nonprofit, you've held fundraisers and have tried to keep the organization going that way. And I assume it's, not an easy thing to do.
It is not. And unfortunately, this being a questionable area that is still uncertain about, where it's going to go, people often hesitate in getting involved. But our friends at Indian Ladder Farms, they see the promise, and they've actually allowed us to host our fundraiser there at no charge. And it was an amazing event, and we brought in Joe McKay, who is the firefighter I spoke about, Ethan Abend, who is a retired NYPD SWAT member who suffered a traumatic brain injury, and also Adam Strauss, who is a comedian who worked through his obsessive compulsive disorder using psilocybin-containing mushrooms, and he put together a whole show about it.
Well, I wonder if you might leave us with a general understanding. Help us understand a little more about mushrooms. That Fantastic Mushrooms documentary talked about how we're learning that mushrooms can help trees share resources under the ground. They form these networks, and there's all different kinds of mushrooms that have different kinds of benefits. Forget the psychedelic part of it, just mushrooms in general. Tell us a little bit.
Mushrooms are fascinating. And I grew up on a sawmill, and I was enamored with the fungi kingdom early on. I love the colors, the shapes, and the fact that they just appeared overnight. They're like magic. All mushrooms are magic, in my opinion. And they form networks and relationships with the plants in their environment. And like you said, they help trees share resources. They pass information back and forth. And for humans, for us, they can help us in so many different ways. Immune boosting, nootropics. We are only scratching the surface on the ways that fungi can help us recover from the damages that we've caused to the environment. Mycoremediation and removing contaminants from soil and helping purify the air. And NASA also has an astromycology branch where they're looking at fungi that absorb radiation. They're called radiotrophic mushrooms that turn ambient radiation into their fruit bodies.
Just when you think you know everything, you really don't. None of us do. We've got to keep our minds open and keep exploring alternatives so that we can learn and perhaps solve problems for human beings who suffer, just like we've been talking about today with Avery Stempel, co-president of New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives. It's nymha.com. Go and check out their information. Avery, I do really appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us about your efforts, and I wish you the best success.
David, thank you so much for having me on.
Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. And join us again next week at this same time for another political conversation. For The Capital Connection, I'm David Guistina.